Snow was falling thick over the Chicago Avenue the morning they dragged a woman out of the Vanaport Tower lobby like a beggar hauled out of a banquet. The guard's grip closed around her arm, pulling her down the ice-covered marble steps, while behind the glass doors, a whole floor of well-dressed employees gathered to laugh and lift their phones to record. "I need to see Mr. Ricci," the woman shouted, one hand clutching the frayed lapel of her coat to keep it from flying open in the freezing wind. Before his signature throws another 100 families out into the street. "Look at this mad woman," a receptionist sneered. "You think a man like the boss would lower himself for someone like you?" Then the silver chain at her wrist slipped free of her sleeve, swaying beneath the pale winter sun. A small bracelet, shaped like a paper boat. At that very moment, Salvatore Ricci stepped down from his gleaming black car. He saw the bracelet, and he went still. The coffee cup in his hand dropped to the ice and shattered, and no one bothered to pick it up. 20 years earlier, he had made that bracelet with his own hands for his little sister. There was only one like it in all the world. "Gianna," he whispered. The laughter died. The woman turned slowly, a thin line of blood seeping where the guard's fingers had scratched her skin. "She said you would recognize it," she said. "But she also warned me recognizing an object always comes easier than recognizing the truth, for men like you." Salvatore went pale. "Where did you get it?" The woman reached into her worn cloth bag and drew out a sealed envelope. "From the woman your family cast out, from the one you believed was a traitor, and from the people your signature is about to rob of their homes. Do not leave this story halfway, because what lies inside that envelope will tear open a lie buried for 9 long years and bring one of the most powerful families in Chicago to its knees. Because the truth this ragged woman carries in her bag is far more dangerous than the bracelet around her wrist. If this story touched your heart, leave a like, share it with someone who needs the reminder that dignity never depends on the clothes a person wears, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss the stories still to come. Salvatore's command fell across the courtyard, dusted with ice, soft yet colder than the winter wind. "Let her go." Only 3 words. The guard gripping Marlowe's arm froze for half a breath, then released her as though he'd just touched something searing hot. No one in Vanaport Tower had ever heard their boss speak so quietly, and it was precisely because his voice was quiet that it was terrifying. People were accustomed to orders delivered through clenched teeth, accustomed to shouts echoing down the corridors. But when Salvatore Ricci lowered his voice, the entire building knew it was time to hold its breath. And they did. The employees who only moments earlier had been raising their phones to record, laughing and calling her a crazy woman, now stood motionless behind the glass doors, their phones slowly sinking like weary arms. The receptionist who had spat out those cruel words a moment ago suddenly felt her throat go dry, and her gaze dropped toward the gleaming stone floor. Salvatore didn't look at any of them. He looked at the woman standing in the middle of the courtyard, snow clinging to the shoulders of her coat like a thin layer of dust. "Take her inside," he told the guard, his voice still carrying that same unsettling calm. "And if your fingers leave one more mark on her, you'll be looking for another job by this afternoon." The guard went pale and nodded frantically, but he didn't dare touch her again. Marlowe walked on her own. That was what stunned the witnesses more than anything else. She was a woman dressed in torn clothes, one shoe split open at the toe and exposing the worn fabric of her sock, her hair clumped together by snow and cold sweat, yet she climbed the granite steps with her back held straight, as though she were the true owner of the building, and all of them were merely uninvited guests. Each step she took left a damp mark on the stone floor, polished so perfectly it could serve as a mirror, and not one person dared follow behind her with a cloth to wipe it away as they usually would. Inside the Vanaport lobby was a world entirely different from the frozen courtyard outside. The ceiling soared overhead, and white marble columns veined with gray rose like tree trunks in a forest built for the wealthy. At the center of the lobby stood a Christmas tree that nearly touched the ceiling, decorated with gold and silver ornaments that shimmered beneath the warm lights. The scent of real pine wood, premium coffee, and expensive perfume lingered in the air. Abstract paintings hung along the walls, and the gold-plated frames alone were worth more than everything Marlowe had ever owned in her life. She passed all of it without so much as a glance, as though those treasures were no different from empty walls. Salvatore walked behind her with both hands tucked into the pockets of his black wool coat, and he realized he was studying her more closely than he wanted to. He'd met countless people who entered this building, carrying every kind of demand. Rivals in tailored suits came to negotiate. Flatterers arrived wearing false smiles. Desperate souls came to beg, their hands trembling and their voices breaking apart. He'd learned to read people within seconds, and the first thing he usually saw in those who had nothing left was fear. But in this woman, he couldn't find it. She wasn't afraid of him. She wasn't afraid of this building. The scratch on her arm was still bleeding, yet she didn't even bother to look down at it. A receptionist asked in a stammering voice whether he wanted additional security called. Salvatore only gave a slight shake of his head. He led Marlowe toward the private executive elevator, the one most employees in the building had never been permitted to enter. When the gleaming steel doors closed, shutting them away from the dozens of curious eyes still fixed upon them, the narrow space suddenly grew heavy and dense. Marlowe stood in one corner, clutching an old cloth bag against her chest with both hands, as though whatever lay inside was more precious than her own life. Salvatore stood in the opposite corner, his eyes still fixed on the paper boat bracelet around her wrist. "You knew my sister," he said. "It wasn't a question." "I know more about you than you think, Mr. Ricci," Marlowe replied, her eyes fixed on the numbers changing across the elevator's electronic display. "For instance, I know that the person you're about to face in that room upstairs isn't me. It's the man you were 9 years ago." She turned to look at him, and there was something in those exhausted eyes, a glimmer of light that made him instinctively step back half a pace. She waited for this day longer than you could ever imagine. It's only a shame she's no longer alive to stand here herself. The elevator continued rising, and Salvatore didn't ask another question. The room occupied the highest floor of the tower, a transparent block of glass suspended above the city like an enormous lantern. From there, all of Chicago spread out below, its rooftops covered in snow, its frozen river gleaming in broken patches, its streets so small they looked as though someone had sketched them with faint pencil strokes. Salvatore opened the door and motioned for her to enter. It was the room where he negotiated his greatest deals, where powerful men had once lowered themselves into the leather chair across from him and departed with bloodless faces. The long table, fashioned from dark walnut, gleamed beneath the lights, and at its head stood a vase of pure white orchids, the flowers his sister had once loved, though no one in the building knew why they were always kept there. Marlowe stopped at the threshold. She didn't take another step toward the table. "Sit down," Salvatore said, pulling out a chair. "I can stand," she replied. "You're bleeding." His gaze shifted toward the scratch on her arm, where the blood had begun to dry into a dark brown streak. "Let me call someone to bring up bandages. There's no need." Her voice was so decisive that his hand stopped halfway through the motion. "I didn't come here to be cared for, Mr. Ricci. In this building, every act of kindness seems to be an investment made in expectation of a return. I don't want to owe you anything, not even a bandage." Salvatore studied her for a long moment, then released the back of the chair. He wasn't accustomed to being refused, and the strange thing was that this refusal didn't anger him, it made him curious. He moved around the head of the table and came a little closer, and once again, his gaze fell upon the bracelet around her wrist. Beneath the room's warm light, he could finally see it clearly. It wasn't silver-colored, as he had assumed in the frozen courtyard. It was real silver, tarnished by the passage of years, and the tiny paper boat bore a dent along its side, a fine scratch that only the person who had made it would recognize. He knew that scratch. He had made it. For one brief moment, the glass room high above Chicago vanished, and he found himself back in a cramped kitchen in Little Italy many years before, where the scent of his mother's tomato sauce still clung to the walls, where a boy of 15 named Salvatore sat bent over his work, carefully shaping strands of fine silver with a pair of pliers borrowed from the shoe repairman downstairs. He had made it for his 12-year-old sister, the little girl who cried easily and constantly begged him to fold paper boats and set them sailing along the gutters whenever it rained. His hand had slipped, and the tip of the pliers had carved a small mark into the side of the boat. He had intended to make another one, but Gianna had snatched it away, pressed it tightly against her heart, and said that a boat with a scar was a boat that had truly gone to sea, while a perfect boat was one that had never dared to leave the harbor. The boy he had been had laughed at her for speaking like a little old woman. The man he was now could no longer remember what his sister's laughter had sounded like, but he had never forgotten the scratch on that paper boat. When he returned to the present, his throat tightened. "This bracelet," he said, and for the first time his voice lost its cold, controlled stillness. "There's only one like it in the world. I made it with my own hands. No one else could possibly have it unless my sister gave it away herself." He raised his eyes to Marlowe, and there was something in them now that resembled a plea, something the people downstairs had never seen in their employer. "Where is Gianna? Is she well? How has she lived all these years? If she sent someone to bring me this bracelet, Then she must be in trouble. Tell me where she is, and I swear to you, no matter how serious that trouble may be, I have enough power to resolve it." Marlowe looked at him, and for the first time since entering the building, something softened briefly in her eyes. It wasn't fear, but a sorrowful compassion she didn't want him to see. She knew that what she was about to say would shatter something inside the powerful man standing before her, and she knew that once the words had been spoken, there would be no way to take them back. She lowered her eyelids, drew in a breath, then slowly faced him. "Gianna isn't anywhere anymore, Mr. Ricci," Marlowe said, forcing her voice to remain steady because she knew that if she allowed it to tremble, she wouldn't be able to finish. "She died nearly a year and a half ago." For one moment, the glass room fell into absolute silence, so complete that the winter wind could be heard whistling through some narrow opening beyond the walls. Salvatore didn't move. His expression didn't change at once, as though those words had to travel a great distance from his ears before they could reach his heart. Then he gave a faint shake of his head, so slight it was almost the gesture of a child refusing to believe what an adult had just told him. "No," he breathed, his voice turning hoarse. "You've mistaken her for someone else. Gianna was young. She was only in her early 30s. People don't die at that age. Rich people don't," Marlowe replied softly. "Poor people do." The sentence fell between them like a stone sinking into still water, and Salvatore suddenly felt both of his hands turn cold. He reached behind him for the back of the chair, and for the first time in that room, he was the one who had to sit down. "What did she die from?" he asked, and he barely recognized his own voice. "Kidney failure," Marlowe said. "Complications from high blood pressure that was never properly treated. Her body had been worn down by years of working far beyond its limits, but if you want the honest answer, I think she died because she carried too many burdens alone for too many years, and no one ever offered a shoulder to help bear their weight." "That isn't a medical answer," he said, and something in his voice sounded almost pleading, as though finding fault with her wording might somehow make the news itself untrue. "It's the answer I have," Marlowe replied. "I'm not a doctor. I'm only the person who stayed beside her after everyone else had gone." She watched the color drain from his face, watched the way his broad shoulders sagged beneath his expensive coat, and she turned away. Not because she pitied him, but because she understood something people who lived in buildings like this never did. The grief of the wealthy always had somewhere to be set down. When they lost someone they loved, the whole world paused to comfort them. People sent flowers, came to offer condolences, and gave them the silence they needed to suffer with dignity. The poor buried their loved ones and returned to work before the earth over the grave had time to dry, because if they took even one shift off to cry, there would be other mouths at home, with nothing to eat the next morning. Salvatore sat there with his hands clasped together on the walnut table, staring at them as though they belonged to a stranger. For the past 9 years, he had trained himself not to think about his sister. Whenever Gianna's name surfaced in a conversation, in a stack of old documents, or at some gathering where someone mentioned her by accident, he buried himself in another task, another phone call, another deal. He had heard vague rumors that she worked with groups that protected the poor, that someone had once seen her in a working-class neighborhood on the south side of the city, and that she was struggling to survive. But he had never tried to learn more. He had told himself that her life no longer had anything to do with him, that she had chosen to turn her back on the family, and that if she suffered, it was the price she had to pay for her betrayal. And now, a woman who slept on the streets was standing in the most expensive room he owned, wearing the bracelet he had once made for his sister, speaking of Gianna's death with the calm voice of someone who had grown far too familiar with loss. "Why didn't she come to me?" he asked, almost in a whisper. "Whatever happened between us, I was still her brother. All it would have taken was one phone call." Marlowe looked at him, and in her eyes was a truth colder than the snow outside. "Perhaps," she said, "because she no longer believed you would answer." Marlowe's words lingered in the air for a long while. Then she placed the old cloth bag on the walnut table beside the vase of white orchids, and the contrast between the two made even her heart ache. She took out the envelope she had held up before him in the courtyard, a brown envelope worn soft at the corners from being handled too many times, and written across it in faded blue ink was his full name, formed by a hand he recognized immediately, even before he could bring himself to touch it. Salvatore Antonio Ricci. He stared at the words, and his fingers went still, unable to break the seal. It was Gianna's handwriting, the script that leaned slightly to the right, the same careless handwriting for which her teacher had punished her when she was a child, the handwriting he hadn't seen in 9 years. She wrote it herself, Marlowe said softly. During her final weeks, when her hands were trembling so badly that she had to begin again several times before she could finish it, she told me that if you were willing to open it, that alone would be a miracle. He drew in a deep breath, then tore through the seal. There were 3 things inside. The first to fall out was a photograph, and when Salvatore saw it, he had to set it down on the table at once, because his hand could no longer hold steady. The photograph showed a woman standing beneath an old corrugated metal awning. The thick black hair he remembered was now streaked with gray, though she hadn't yet reached 40. Her face had grown painfully gaunt, her cheekbones rising sharply beneath her pale, sickly skin, but her eyes were unchanged. They were still the eyes of the little sister who had once begged him to fold paper boats and set them sailing through the rain gutters, eyes that still smiled even when her entire body had been worn down by exhaustion. She stood before a row of low, ramshackle buildings, old apartments crowded together along a damp and desolate street, and though she had become so thin, she still held her head high before the camera, just as the woman standing in this room had held hers high while climbing the stone steps a short while earlier. Salvatore touched his fingertip to his sister's face in the photograph, so gently that it seemed he was afraid he might hurt her. She was so thin, he said, and his voice broke on the final word. The second item inside the envelope was a sheet of paper folded into quarters, and when he opened it, he found the first page of a real estate acquisition file. Printed in bold letters across the top was the name of a residential district called Harbor Line, along with the familiar logo of the very Vanaport Corporation he now controlled. Salvatore frowned. He had approved hundreds of projects like this one. They had passed across his desk like flowing water, and the name Harbor Line stirred nothing particular in his memory. "This is only an ordinary urban development project," he said. "I don't understand what it has to do with my sister." "Read the third item first," Marlowe said. The third item was a letter written on both sides of a yellowed sheet of graph paper, and Salvatore unfolded it with hands that were no longer steady. "Brother, if the person carrying this letter is standing before you, then it means every lawful door I ever knocked upon has already been slammed shut. Don't help her because she is wearing my bracelet. Don't listen because you think she may somehow be connected to you. Listen because for all these years, your corporation has never once been willing to hear the people who possess nothing in this world except the homes they live in. Ask for the file marked AR 2009. Ask why the compensation list for the residents being displaced contains the names of people who died before the project was ever approved. Ask why there are bank accounts receiving compensation on behalf of dozens of different households, yet the account numbers match one another digit for digit. And when someone tells you that I was the thief, that I betrayed you, ask yourself one question and one question only. Who benefited from your anger for the past 9 years? Gianna." Salvatore finished the letter, then read it a second time, and then a third, and each time his eyes stopped on the line, saying that she had knocked upon every lawful door, only to have them all slammed shut. He looked up at Marlowe, and for the first time in 9 years, a question he had buried long ago began to stir inside his mind. "I was told that she was the one who embezzled money from the company," he said slowly, "that she betrayed the family, that she ran away because she was ashamed. And you believed it," Marlowe said, "because believing it was far easier than asking yourself who had told you that story." Marlowe's words hadn't yet settled when the conference room door swung open, and a young man in a gray suit stepped inside with tension drawn across his face, holding a phone whose screen was still glowing. It was Dominic Serra, Salvatore's most trusted lieutenant, the man who had been at his side since the earliest days and knew exactly when he was permitted to interrupt his boss. "I'm sorry to intrude," Dominic said quietly, his eyes flicking briefly toward the woman in torn clothing, before turning away at once, as though he had never seen her. "But this can't wait. It's about Halloran. We have the evidence." Salvatore placed his sister's letter on the table, and Marlowe watched something strange happen to his face. The grief that had been etched around his eyes only moments before disappeared within a single blink, concealed beneath something colder and flatter, like the surface of a lake freezing solid after one night of bitter wind. The man who had trembled while holding his sister's photograph was gone, and in his place stood someone entirely different. "Give it to me," Salvatore said, taking the phone. He raised it to his ear, and when he spoke, his voice was so calm it sent a chill through the room. "Hello, Frank. Do you remember that 9 years ago, I personally vouched for you when you entered this world? I placed the Ricci family name behind you as a guarantee. And now I've just seen the figures showing what you transferred to the other side. A panicked man's voice burst from the other end of the line, pouring out stumbling explanations in a frantic rush, broken by the sound of quick, shallow breaths. Salvatore listened without interrupting, his eyes fixed on the glass wall overlooking the snow-covered city, and not a single emotion disturbed his face. When the voice on the other end finally fell silent, he continued in that same deadly, level tone. "I don't need an explanation, Frank. I'm only calling to let you know that from this moment forward, every door that ever opened for you will close. Your bank will demand repayment of your loans tomorrow morning. The partners who once shook your hand won't answer their phones. The seat you occupy on that council will belong to someone else next week. Not one hair on your head will be harmed. I promise you that. But by sunset tomorrow, you'll understand that there are ways to make a man disappear without ever laying a hand on him." Then he ended the call without waiting for an answer and returned the phone to Dominic with a slight nod. Dominic took it, bowed his head, and quietly left the room, closing the door behind him without making a sound. Marlowe remained where she was, having witnessed every moment, and for the first time since entering the building, she felt a chill travel down her spine. She had heard the rumors about the Ricci family, about how Vanaport appeared on the surface to be a glittering real estate empire, while beneath its shell of glass and marble ran hidden currents no one dared name, money whose origins couldn't be explained, rivals who suddenly withdrew from lucrative deals, signatures placed on documents in sealed rooms where no lawyers were ever present. People said this family lived by a rule older than the law itself, the rule of silence, and that anyone who entered their circle either remained loyal until death or had their name erased from the game so quietly that no one noticed. Now she understood that none of those rumors had been exaggerated. The man who had learned of his sister's death and nearly broken down only minutes earlier was the same man who had just destroyed another person's entire career with one brief phone call, without raising his voice even once. She realized that to bring Gianna's truth into the light, she would have to place her trust in someone more dangerous than anyone she had ever faced. Salvatore turned back toward her, and perhaps he read the thought in her eyes, because when he spoke, his voice had softened slightly, though it still carried the coldness from moments before. "You're afraid of me." "I'm cautious around you," she replied. "A wise person would be," he said. "But you should understand one thing. The man I just dealt with betrayed my trust. My sister never did. If what's written in this letter is true, then you aren't the one who should be afraid." Salvatore walked around the desk and lowered himself into his leather chair, and this time he looked at Marlowe differently, with the gaze of a man accustomed to dissecting every person who entered his room until he discovered what they truly wanted. "You still haven't told me who you are," he said. "My sister gave you the most precious bracelet she ever owned. She wrote her final letter and trusted you to place it directly into my hands. People don't do that with a stranger they happen to meet along the way." "How old are you?" 28, Marlowe replied. He made the calculation in his mind, and she saw it pass through his eyes before he could conceal it. The instinctive response of a man who had spent his entire life surviving through numbers. A faint, dry laugh escaped her, carrying no trace of amusement. "There," she said. "That is always the first thing men like you calculate." "What are you talking about?" "You're wondering whether I might be related to you. You're looking at my age, trying to see if I could be a cousin or someone sharing Ricci blood. You're wondering whether the ragged woman standing before you might share the blood of the Ricci family." Salvatore didn't deny it. He merely leaned back in his chair, clasped his hands together, and regarded her with renewed attention. "Are you?" "No," Marlowe said, and she said it so bluntly that he could find no reason to doubt her. "I'm not your niece. I don't have a single drop of your family's blood in my veins. I know you want to believe otherwise, because if I were family, everything would be much simpler for you. You would have a clean reason to help me, a reason you could speak aloud without discomfort. Blood, but life doesn't arrange itself so neatly." She placed one hand on the old cloth bag, and her voice softened, not because she wished to comfort him, but because what she was about to reveal was something she rarely told anyone. "My name is Marlowe Bennett. My mother worked 2 jobs at once, until the day she no longer had enough strength to stand. My father left when I was too young to remember his face. I grew up in places where no one ever took photographs to hang on walls like the ones in your lobby. I scrubbed floors, washed dishes, and cleaned offices for people who couldn't even be bothered to look at my face as they walked past me. I met Gianna during the darkest period of my life, when I believed I had nothing left to lose. It turned out I was wrong, because she gave me something I thought I would never possess again." She paused without explaining what that something was. Salvatore listened, and he realized he was unsettled in a way he hadn't felt for a very long time. In his world, everyone who entered this room came carrying a need, and that need could always be translated into something tangible: money, power, a favor, protection. He had taught himself to look through every face and identify what the person behind it truly wanted, and once he found it, he knew he held control. But this woman wasn't begging him for anything. She didn't ask for money. She didn't ask to be protected. She had even refused a simple bandage for the wound on her arm. She stood there in torn clothing, with one ruined shoe, speaking to him as though he were the one who needed something from her. "What do you want from me, Miss Bennett?" he asked directly, and it was the most honest question he had spoken all morning. Marlowe studied him for a long moment. "You see," she said softly, "even now, you're still trying to discover what I need so you can decide how much it will cost you. But I didn't come here to take anything from you. I came to return something your sister entrusted to me, and to ask you one question, whether you have enough courage to read everything she left behind." About an hour's drive south of Vanaport Tower, in a bend of the city where the streets were no longer plowed regularly and the streetlights flickered uncertainly between brightness and darkness, stood an aging apartment complex called Harbor Line. It was the place Marlowe called home, or at least the closest thing to a home she had known in recent years. The rows of red brick buildings had faded into a dull brown beneath decades of rain and wind, their rusted iron balconies strung with clotheslines, frozen stiff in the winter cold, and at the entrance to every building were cracked concrete steps that the residents had patched year after year with money from their own pockets. Yet inside that worn and neglected exterior was something the glass towers in the heart of the city could never possess. At Harbor Line, people knew one another's names. They knocked on a neighbor's door when they heard an unfamiliar cough in the middle of the night. They shared a pot of soup while it was still warm when they learned that the family next door had just lost a job. This was where people the city had forgotten had woven a safety net with their own hands to catch one another, and now that net was in danger of being cut apart. Harbor Line wasn't merely the place where Marlowe lived. It was the very name printed in bold across the file she had just placed on Salvatore Ricci's desk. For months, the Vanaport Corporation had been quietly acquiring ownership rights around the property, and notices of eviction had begun appearing beneath the doors of every apartment, printed on glossy white paper in language so polite it felt chilling, offering the residents a pitiful amount of compensation and a deadline by which they were expected to leave. For families who had lived there for decades, the money wasn't even enough to cover the security deposit on another home in the same city. This wasn't a purchase. It was an order to drive people out, dressed in the respectable clothing of a lawful real estate transaction. And what none of the Harbor Line residents knew was that the man who had signed off on the project as it passed across his desk had heard the truth about it for the first time, that very morning, from the lips of the woman his employees had dragged away from the entrance like a beggar. The person who had organized the Harbor Line residents in their resistance against the eviction order was an older woman named Odessa Wright, a retired schoolteacher with silver-white hair, always pinned neatly at the nape of her neck, and a deep, warm voice every child in the neighborhood had heard during the free reading lessons she gave in the community room. Odessa had lived in building number 4 for nearly 30 years, had buried her husband while still living in that very apartment, and had declared bluntly that they would have to carry her out because she would never leave on her own feet. At her side stood a middle-aged man named Reuben Cole, a plumber who had repaired nearly every apartment in the complex without charge whenever the winter cold burst the water pipes, and who had also been the first to notice that something was wrong with the numbers printed on the compensation documents. It was Reuben who had gone to Gianna for help several months earlier, while she was still alive, asking her to help the residents understand the papers they were being told to sign. From that moment, an invisible thread had connected the impoverished Harbor Line complex to the glass room at the highest floor of Vanaport Tower, a thread whose two ends Marlowe now held in her hands. For her, this fight had never been only about keeping a promise to someone who had died. It was also about her own home, about the people who had taken her in when she had nothing left, and about one small, precious thing she was protecting with everything that remained of her life. To understand why Marlowe Bennett could stand with her back straight before a man as powerful as Salvatore Ricci without wavering, one would have to return to the life she had lived before, to the time when she still believed that life would show kindness to those willing to work hard. Many years earlier, Marlowe had once possessed a small home that was complete in its own humble way. She had a husband who worked as an electrician, a rented apartment on the 3rd floor with a window overlooking an old maple tree, and most important of all, She had a son named Elias, a little boy with bright eyes and a clear, joyful laugh that could make the weariness of an entire day disappear from her heart in a single moment. She still remembered the mornings when she carried him onto the balcony to watch the maple leaves change color, remembered the way his tiny hand wrapped around her finger whenever the family crossed the street, and remembered the scent of his hair after a bath. She had once believed that even though they were poor, she was the richest woman in the world because she possessed everything a human heart could ever wish for. Then the illness came, silent and merciless, like a storm advancing from the horizon, without a single warning. It began with fevers she mistook for an ordinary cold, then with moments when her son became unusually tired, and by the time the doctors finally gave the illness its proper name, everything had already traveled far beyond the reach of a mother who didn't have enough money for the best treatments. Marlo did everything a human being could possibly do. She sold every possession in their home, one by one. She begged in places where she had never imagined she would have to lower her head. She spent countless sleepless nights in cold hospital corridors, praying to a higher power she wasn't even certain existed. But there are doors that will never open for those without money, no matter how long they knock or how badly their hands begin to bleed. And in the end, she was forced to learn the cruelest lesson life reserves for the poor, that sometimes even the deepest love isn't enough to hold on to one small and precious life. She lost her son on a late autumn afternoon, just as the final maple leaves were falling from the branches, and a part of her died with him in that very moment. Her husband couldn't endure the weight of their loss. There are men who, when faced with pain too great to bear, choose to turn away and run instead of tightening their grip on the hand of the person beside them and walking through the darkness together. He began coming home late. Then there were nights when he didn't return at all. And one morning Marlo awoke to find his closet empty, leaving her alone in an apartment that had grown so silent that the ticking of the clock on the wall sounded like the pounding of a hammer. She lost her child, lost her husband, and then lost the apartment when she could no longer afford the rent. She sank toward the lowest depths of the city through nights spent seeking shelter in churches, days wandering in search of work with an empty stomach, and evenings huddled inside bus stations to escape the cold that cut through her skin. She reached the boundary where a person could no longer tell the difference between being alive and simply not being dead yet. It was on the darkest of those nights, when Marlo sat curled up inside a homeless shelter with her arms wrapped around her knees and her eyes staring blankly into the distance because she no longer cared what happened, that a woman came and sat beside her. The woman didn't ask what had happened to her. She simply placed a cup of hot tea in Marlo's hands and said that sometimes the only thing a person needed to do on a night like that was survive until morning, and tomorrow they could decide what to do about tomorrow. That woman was Gianna, the woman who carried the Ricci name but had abandoned everything connected to it, the woman who lived among people in desperate circumstances and worked tirelessly to help them understand their own rights. Gianna didn't give Marlo money, nor did she promise to change her life. She did something far more precious. She taught Marlo how to read the small print on official documents, how to tell the difference between an application for assistance and a paper surrendering her legal rights, and how to walk into an office with her head held high and demand what she deserved to receive. She taught her that dignity wasn't something other people granted, but something no one had the right to take away. Slowly, day after day, Gianna pulled Marlo upward from the bottom of the abyss, not by giving her something to keep her afloat, but by teaching her that she still had enough strength left to swim on her own. In the years that followed, the friendship between the two women grew into something closer to kinship than any bond of blood. But fate had never been generous to people like them, and the illness continued to eat quietly through Gianna's strength season after season, until that final night, a winter night when the blizzard swept across the city with such violence that the entire shelter trembled beneath the howl of the wind. Gianna lay on an iron bed, pushed against the thin wall, her breathing already shallow and broken, and each time her chest rose, her whole body shuddered from the effort. Marlo knelt beside her, holding Gianna's frail hand tightly between both of her own, trying to pass the last of her warmth into it, though deep in her heart she knew that this time there would be no tomorrow in which to decide what came next. Outside, the wind hurled snow against the window with a sharp scraping sound, while the weak yellow light in the room flickered whenever the electricity faltered, casting a fragile glow over Gianna's pale face, as delicate as the life slowly fading from her. "Marlo," Gianna whispered, her voice so faint that Marlo had to lean close to hear her. "Don't cry. People like us don't have time to cry for very long." She tried to smile, the same smile Marlo had seen hundreds of times, the smile that still shone even when her entire body had been exhausted beyond endurance. Then, with trembling fingers, she reached for her wrist, removed the silver bracelet shaped like a paper boat that she had never once taken off in all those years, and placed it in Marlowe's palm, closing Marlowe's fingers around it. "This bracelet," she said, "is the only key that can open a door that has been sealed shut for 9 years. There is a man in this city, a powerful man, a man the whole world fears. He is my brother. He believes I am a traitor, and I have allowed him to believe that all this time, because there are truths a person will never agree to hear until they are ready to face them for themselves. When the day comes that you need him to believe you, don't say anything, just show him this bracelet. He will recognize it at once, because he made it with his own hands." She paused to catch her breath, and a fit of coughing twisted her frail body in upon itself. Marlowe wanted to tell her to stop speaking, not to waste her strength, to save what little breath remained, but Gianna shook her head because she knew she no longer had enough time to be sparing with it. "There is one more thing," she said, and this time her voice caught, not because of the illness, but because of a fear she had carried in her heart throughout her final months. "Poppy, she is sleeping at Odessa's home tonight. She doesn't know anything, and I am begging you to make sure she never has to witness a moment like this. I can't leave her alone in this world. I have considered every path, and I can't think of anyone but you. You understand the pain of losing a child, so I believe you will understand the value of being given one. Raise her as your own daughter. Let her grow up somewhere peaceful, far away from the world I was born into. Never allow those powerful people to turn her into a piece on their game board. Promise me." Marlowe lowered her head, tears falling onto their tightly clasped hands, and she answered in a voice that broke but never wavered. "I promise. I swear to you. I will protect her with my entire life." Gianna heard that promise, and a final peace spread across her face, smoothing away the lines carved there by years of carrying more than any one person should have borne. "Then I can rest," she whispered. "You know, when I first met you, I thought I was saving you, but it turns out you were the one who stayed beside me until the very end." Her hand tightened around Marlowe's one last time, then slowly loosened, and her shallow breathing grew slower and slower until it blended into the storm outside and could no longer be separated from the sound of the wind. Marlowe remained motionless in that flickering darkness for a very long time, pressing the paper boat bracelet against her chest, and in the grief that seemed ready to drown her for the second time in her life. There was only one thing that kept her from collapsing. Somewhere warm, not far away, a little girl was sleeping peacefully, and from that night forward, that child had a mother. Now, nearly a year and a half after that stormy night, the little girl Gianna had entrusted to Marlowe was 6 years old, and she carried a name as gentle as a flower, Poppy. On the afternoon Marlowe returned from Vanaport Tower, when dusk had begun to settle and the dim yellow streetlights were flickering to life across Harbor Line, the little girl was sitting beside the window of the small apartment she shared with her mother, her face pressed close to the cold glass, her large round eyes following every figure passing along the street as she waited for one familiar shape to appear. The moment she saw her mother turn into the alley, Poppy's face lit up as though someone had kindled a candle inside her, and she scrambled down from the chair, rushed toward the door, and nearly tripped over the doormat with her small feet. "Mommy's home," she cried, throwing her arms around Marlowe's legs and looking up with a smile that revealed the gap where one of her front teeth had recently fallen out. "I drew pictures for you all afternoon. Miss Odessa said I draw really well." Marlowe bent down and lifted her into her arms, pressing her cheek against the child's soft hair, which still carried the warm scent of sunlight, and within that small, comforting embrace, all the exhaustion and tension of a long day spent facing the most powerful man in the city seemed to melt away. Their apartment was so small that only a few steps were needed to cross from the front door to the window, and most of the furniture consisted of old pieces given to them by neighbors or things Marlowe had found, repaired, and restored herself, but she had transformed it into a true home through things that cost no money at all. The wall beside Poppy's bed was covered with drawings made by her own small hands, and on the little wooden table beside the window, there was always a box of colored pencils and a stack of paper that Marlowe had saved carefully to buy for her daughter, because she understood better than anyone that a child needed to draw her dreams, even when the reality surrounding her was still filled with hardship. That evening, after a simple meal of soup and bread, Poppy spread her paper and pencils across the table and bent over her drawing, the tip of her little tongue peeking from the corner of her mouth in deep concentration, while Marlowe sat beside her with a cup of hot tea cradled in her hands. quietly watching her child. "What are you drawing?" she asked. "Boats," Poppy replied without looking up. "Paper boats." "I really like drawing boats." Marlowe looked down at the sheet of paper, and her heart tightened gently. Paper boats covered the entire page, dozens of them. Some floated upon curving lines the child had drawn to represent water, while others drifted through the air between clouds. And every single boat had been drawn in the same distinctive shape, with the bow turned slightly upward and the sides folded into clear, sharp creases, a way of making paper boats that Marlowe knew Poppy hadn't learned from her. "Who taught you to fold boats this way?" she asked, trying to keep her voice natural. Poppy thought for a moment, then answered with the certainty only a child could possess. "I don't remember who taught me. I only know that I know how to fold them. I always have pictures of these boats inside my head, Mommy. I think they're beautiful." The little girl looked up, her clear eyes fixed upon her mother, completely unaware that her innocent drawings had just touched something sacred that she was still far too young to understand. Marlowe reached out and gently smoothed her daughter's hair, and she thought of the silver bracelet resting inside her coat pocket, the bracelet shaped like a paper boat identical to the ones this child had drawn from somewhere deep within a memory she couldn't yet name. Marlowe said nothing. She simply drew Poppy into her arms, pressed a kiss to her forehead, and silently promised herself that no matter what price she might have to pay, she would keep this little girl safe and happy, just as she had sworn to do on that stormy night. "Your drawing is beautiful," she whispered. "Tomorrow, we'll hang it on the wall." And Poppy laughed. A bright, ringing laugh that filled the little room and drove away the winter cold knocking at the door outside. While Marlowe held her daughter close as they slept in their small harbor-line apartment across the city, the lights in the office at the highest floor of Vanaport Tower remained on until late into the night. Salvatore Ricci sat alone behind the walnut desk, with his sister's letter smoothed flat before him and the photograph of a gaunt Gianna propped against the base of the vase filled with white orchids. He had read that letter more times than he could count that evening, and each time his eyes stopped at the file code his sister had mentioned, AR 2009. At last, he picked up the phone and called Dominic Serra, and when his trusted associate entered the room, Salvatore gave him a brief but decisive order. "I need you to obtain the complete file for the Harbor Line project. Don't go through the legal department, don't go through the project division, and don't let anyone in this building know that I'm the one requesting it. Handle this personally, and report back to me alone." Dominic frowned, because in all the years he had worked beside his boss, this was the first time he had ever received an order to conceal something from the company's own machinery. The next 3 days became 3 days in which Salvatore began to realize that something was deeply wrong within the very empire he had always believed he controlled absolutely. Dominic returned with confusion written across his face and a stack of papers far thinner than it should have been. "Something isn't right," he said, placing the file on the desk. "The original file marked AR 2009 should be 10 times this thick, but when I accessed the archive system, most of the important documents had been marked as transferred into a special security status, available only to those with the highest authorization. And the strange thing is, sir, even you, as head of the corporation, aren't included on the list of people permitted to view them." Salvatore's head snapped up. "Say that again. There are documents inside my own company that I'm not allowed to read." "That's correct," Dominic replied. "And the only name on the authorization list, aside from a few lower-level employees, belongs to Mr. Alberto's office." The name fell into the room like a stone tumbling into a deep ravine, and for a moment, Salvatore said nothing. Alberto Ricci was his uncle, his father's younger brother, the man who had stood beside him at his parents' funeral, placed a hand on his shoulder, and told him that from that day forward, he would care for him in his father's place. The man Salvatore had trusted with countless critical matters throughout the years he spent building his empire. It was because of that trust that, many years earlier, when Salvatore was still young and overwhelmed by 100 battles at once, he had signed a broad power of attorney, granting Alberto the authority to make decisions and approve many kinds of transactions on his behalf, without requiring Salvatore to review every detail. He had signed it without truly reading it, because he believed that blood never betrayed blood. "No," Salvatore said quietly, more to himself than to Dominic. "Uncle Alberto wouldn't do this. He's family." But the moment those words left his mouth, he heard how hollow they sounded, because they were exactly what people had told him about Gianna 9 years earlier. That family didn't betray family, and he had used that very reasoning to condemn his sister without ever once verifying the truth for himself. "Find another way to access those documents," he said, his voice returning to its familiar cold stillness. "And Dominic, from this moment forward, be extremely careful. If what I'm beginning to suspect is true, then we no longer know for certain who in this building is truly on our side." The key to opening the door Salvatore had just encountered lay with someone whose existence he didn't even know about. A woman named Nadia Voss, an attorney within Vanaport Corporation's own legal department. Nadia was a reserved woman of about 40, always impeccably dressed, and so quiet in her work that almost no one had noticed her for years, and that was precisely what had allowed her to see things she was never supposed to see. Many years earlier, when Gianna was still tirelessly helping residents of working-class neighborhoods understand their rights, Nadia had been the person who secretly passed her the first copies of File AR 2009, documents proving that something corrupt was unfolding beneath the glittering surface of the urban development projects. Nadia had done it because she owed Gianna a debt of kindness from an earlier chapter of her life that she had never fully explained to anyone. She only said that there had once been a time when she stood on the brink of losing everything, and Gianna had been the person who reached out and pulled her back. For that reason, when Nadia learned of Gianna's death, she lived with a quiet, persistent sense of guilt, feeling as though she still owed the woman who was gone a promise she had never completely fulfilled. Marlowe had learned about Nadia from Gianna herself, who had once told her that if the day ever came when she needed evidence buried deep inside the corporation, there was one person within its walls who could be trusted. And so, only a few days after the meeting at the tower, a strange gathering took place in a small, secluded coffee shop on the outskirts of the city, where three people who had no ordinary reason to share the same table found one another because of a common purpose. Marlowe arrived carrying her old cloth bag and wearing a guarded expression. Nadia came in a dark coat with the manner of someone who was constantly looking over her shoulder. Salvatore arrived alone, without Dominic beside him, something that felt unfamiliar even to Salvatore himself. When Salvatore asked why an attorney employed by his company would risk her entire career to smuggle documents outside, Nadia looked directly into his eyes and told him that some debts couldn't be repaid with money, and that she wasn't doing this for him, but for a woman who had died and deserved to have her name cleared. The three of them formed an alliance, but it was a fragile one, held together more by grief and shared purpose than by trust. Salvatore, guided by the instincts of a man who had spent his entire life surrounded by schemes, still kept a certain degree of caution toward the attorney. There was something about Nadia he couldn't read, an unusual silence whenever she spoke of her life before joining Vanaport, a subtle avoidance in her eyes whenever the conversation turned toward why she had chosen to remain inside a corporation she knew was doing wrong instead of leaving long ago. But for the moment, he didn't have enough time or enough choices to doubt the only ally capable of helping him enter the heart of his own machinery. "If you can obtain the original documents that have been locked away," Salvatore told Nadia, "we will have enough evidence to expose everything." Nadia nodded slowly. "I will try," she replied. "But Mr. Ricci, you should understand that once we begin pulling at this thread, we won't be able to predict what it may unravel, and not every truth is easy to bear, even for the person searching for it." Marlowe looked at the two of them, and a vague sense of foreboding rose within her, warning that the road ahead held many more turns than any of them could foresee. After Nadia left the coffee shop first to avoid being seen with them, Salvatore and Marlowe remained a little longer, and in the silence that followed, he finally voiced the question that had troubled him since that first morning. "There is one thing I still don't understand," he said, slowly turning the cup of cold coffee between his hands. "The day you came to the tower, you allowed my men to drag you away from the entrance. You let them mock you, record you, and humiliate you in front of dozens of people. You are an intelligent woman, Miss Bennett. You could easily have found a way to arrange a private meeting with me, sent the letter through an attorney, or approached me somewhere more secluded. So why did you choose the most painful and humiliating way possible?" Marlowe remained silent for a moment, then raised her eyes to him, and a tired yet meaningful smile briefly touched her lips. "Because that is exactly what Gianna told me to do," she said. Salvatore's head lifted sharply, and Marlowe slowly began to tell him what she had kept secret until that moment. During the final days of her life, Gianna hadn't merely given Marlowe the bracelet and her dying request. She had also left her detailed instructions explaining precisely how she must approach her powerful brother. She understood him better than anyone else in the world. She knew that Salvatore Ricci was a man who had built countless walls around himself, and that if a letter were sent through the mail, One of his secretaries would intercept it and throw it away before he ever had the chance to see the envelope. If an unfamiliar attorney requested a meeting, the appointment would be postponed from one week to the next, until it eventually disappeared into oblivion. If someone attempted to approach him in private, his security team would stop that person before they ever came close. She told me, Marlowe continued, that the only way to force her brother to truly see the bracelet was to place it directly in front of him somewhere so public that he couldn't turn away, couldn't order someone else to handle it for him, and couldn't pretend he had never seen it. She said you would only face the truth when you were cornered in a situation your pride wouldn't allow you to flee from, when dozens of eyes were watching, and the honor of the Ricci family itself had been placed upon the scales. Salvatore sat in silence as the full meaning of what he had just heard settled over him. The scene he had mistaken for the desperate act of a destitute woman, risking everything to reach him, had actually been a carefully calculated move. A trap set by his own dead sister, the woman who understood him so well that she could predict each of his reactions despite having been separated from him for 9 years. And Marlowe, the woman he had assumed was merely a reluctant messenger, had actually entered his tower with a plan already formed in her mind. She had willingly allowed herself to be dragged, humiliated, and scratched until her skin bled, solely to ensure that the moment he saw the bracelet would become a moment he could never deny. "You endured all of that," he said slowly, deliberately. "I made a promise to a woman who is about to die," Marlowe replied, "and I am the kind of person who keeps her promises, Mr. Ricci, no matter what the price may be. The scratch on my arm will heal, but if I had allowed you another chance to turn your back on the truth, then my promise to Gianna would never have been fulfilled." Salvatore looked at the woman seated across from him with entirely new eyes, and for the first time, the caution he had always reserved for her gave way to something close to respect. He had spent his entire life confronting powerful people, those who used money and influence to obtain whatever they desired. Yet this penniless woman had turned her own vulnerability into a weapon, transformed humiliation into leverage, and defeated him on his own ground without needing anything except courage and a promise. "My sister chose the right person," he said softly. And this time, Marlowe said nothing in return, because it was the kindest thing a man like him could possibly have said. At a mansion hidden behind towering iron gates on the northern edge of the city, where neatly trimmed evergreens stood beneath thick layers of white snow, Alberto Ricci sat in his study beside a blazing fireplace, a glass of red wine in his hand, listening to a report that drew the faintest smile across his lips. The man was in his 60s, with silver hair combed smoothly back, and a benevolent face that led nearly everyone meeting him for the first time to mistake him for a gentle gentleman of the upper class, a kindly uncle who always had an amusing story ready and a warm hand to place upon someone's shoulder. But beneath that comforting appearance was a mind colder and more patient than almost anyone else in their world, a man who had learned very early that true power didn't belong to the person who shouted the loudest in the room, but to the person who smiled while quietly pulling every string from behind the curtain. Alberto was the one who had created the entire network of fraud concealed beneath Vanaport's urban development projects, and he had done it with such sophistication that no one had questioned him for years. He understood that his nephew Salvatore, though sharp and merciless in major negotiations, possessed one fatal weakness: his absolute trust in blood and family. Alberto had patiently nurtured that trust over the years, playing the role of the devoted uncle who had cared for his orphan nephew in his father's place, until the day when Salvatore, still young and exhausted from expanding his empire on 100 different fronts, signed a sweeping power of attorney granting his uncle the authority to make decisions on his behalf in countless transactions. Salvatore had signed it without truly reading it, believing he was entrusting the work to the most dependable man in the world. But to Alberto, that document was the key that opened every door, the perfect cover that allowed him to siphon enormous sums intended for relocation compensation, transforming projects carried out in the name of progress into a private money-making machine, all of it conducted beneath his nephew's name and signature. 9 years earlier, when Gianna discovered the truth and tried to expose it, Alberto had been the one to strike first. He knew he couldn't allow his stubborn niece to destroy the machine he had spent so long building. So instead of confronting her directly, he did what a clever man always did. He reshaped the truth into something that served him. He whispered into Salvatore's ear that Gianna herself was embezzling company money, that his sister had abused the family's trust for personal gain, and that the accusations she was making were nothing more than a preemptive attack from someone desperate to conceal her own guilt. Salvatore, consumed by the anger and pain of a brother who believed he had been betrayed, accepted his uncle's story without investigating it even once. In that way, Alberto had destroyed his niece, not through violence, but by taking away the most precious thing she still possessed, the trust of the only family member she had left, and condemning her to years of wandering and hardship until exhaustion finally claimed her life. Now, seated beside the warmth of the fire, Alberto had just received word that someone was quietly asking questions about file AR-2009, and that Salvatore himself appeared to be behind the unusual requests for access. A less capable man would have panicked. Alberto merely took a sip of wine, set the glass down, and allowed a cold glint to pass through his kindly eyes. So the boy has finally become curious, he murmured to himself. He had silenced the threat named Gianna once before, and if necessary, he wouldn't hesitate to do the same again to anyone who dared reach into the past and pull it open. He picked up the phone, called someone he trusted inside Vanaport Tower, and issued his instructions in the chillingly calm voice of a man who had never understood hesitation. "I need to know exactly who my nephew is speaking with," he said. "And I need to know immediately." Alberto Ricci wasn't the kind of man who waited for his enemy to strike first, and he had learned long ago that the best way to extinguish a fire was to smother it while it was still no more than a glowing ember. Only a few days after discovering that his nephew had begun asking questions about the old file, he summoned an emergency meeting of the family council, the council made up of older men who held crucial positions throughout the Ricci Empire, men whose loyalty could be purchased with profit and reinforced through fear. Salvatore entered the conference room without realizing that he was walking directly into a trap that had already been prepared for him, and when the heavy door closed behind his back, he immediately understood from the evasive eyes of men who had always lowered their heads before him that something had changed. Alberto sat at the head of the table, in the seat that rightfully belonged to Salvatore, and he didn't rise when his nephew entered. "Sit down, Salvatore," he said, his voice gentle, as though he were welcoming a guest. "We need to discuss the direction you have been taking lately." What followed was a masterful display of manipulation. Alberto never raised his voice, and never made an openly hostile accusation. He simply explained to the council, slowly and carefully, that his beloved nephew had begun behaving strangely, that Salvatore was secretly digging through old files that had been closed long ago, that he was placing his faith in the words of a homeless woman of unknown origin who had appeared from nowhere carrying fabricated stories, and that he was even conspiring with an attorney inside the company to leak confidential documents to outsiders, threatening the security of the entire family. "I love this boy as though he were my own son," Alberto said, lifting one hand to wipe his eyes in a perfectly performed gesture of sorrow. "But I fear that his obsession with the past, with the sister who betrayed us all those years ago, is causing him to lose his judgment. And when the man at the head of the family is no longer thinking clearly, it becomes our responsibility to protect the empire our forefathers worked so hard to build." Each of Alberto's words fell like another brick in the wall, closing around Salvatore, and he realized with horror that the council members were nodding in agreement. Before he could object, Alberto presented the proposal he had prepared in advance, that Salvatore's authority over major projects should be temporarily suspended, that his access to the corporation's sensitive accounts and systems should be frozen, all in the name of stability, and until he could prove that he had regained his clarity of mind. In the course of a single afternoon, the man who had once made an entire tower hold its breath whenever he lowered his voice, the man who had destroyed another person's career with a single phone call, suddenly found himself stripped of most of his power inside the very empire he led, isolated by the people he had once believed belonged to him. "What are you doing, uncle?" Salvatore asked, his voice low and taut, like a cord on the verge of snapping. "You know that what I am searching for is the truth." Alberto merely looked at him with falsely gentle eyes. "I am saving you, my boy," he replied. "One day, you will understand." But Alberto didn't stop after isolating his nephew. That same evening, Nadia Voss received a call from an unfamiliar number, and the voice on the other end, calm and never openly threatening, made the blood in her veins turn cold. The caller mentioned her name, mentioned the address of her apartment, then gently brought up something from her past, something she had buried for years, and believed no one else still knew, before ending with a piece of advice that some doors were best left closed, because once they were opened, she might not be the only person forced to pay the price. Nadia lowered the phone with trembling hands, and for the first time since everything had begun, she felt genuine fear creeping into her heart. At the same time, during a private conversation between Alberto and one of his trusted associates, another of his concerns was expressed in the cold language of men who regarded human beings as nothing more than pieces on a board. He spoke of the possibility that if any child carrying Gianna's direct bloodline still existed in the world, that child would pose the greatest threat to the inheritance rights and control over the assets he had seized, and that such a threat would have to be found and neutralized before it had the chance to become a problem. When Salvatore learned of this through Dominic at the end of that day, a chill traveled down his spine, because he knew nothing about the existence of any child, but he understood that his uncle had just chosen a new target, and that this war had now reached far beyond the pages of an old file. Stripped of nearly all his authority and isolated within his own empire, Salvatore now had only one path left: to hold on to the people on the other side of the city, the very people he wouldn't even have bothered to notice not long ago. That afternoon, he drove himself to Harbor Line without a chauffeur or bodyguards, and as his luxurious car moved slowly along the uneven streets beneath flickering streetlights, he saw with his own eyes the place that one stroke of his pen had nearly erased from existence. Marlowe opened the door with surprise written across her face, because she hadn't expected a man like him to set foot there in person, and for a brief moment she stood blocking the doorway. Her instinct to protect Rising before reason could remind her that this man was now an ally. "I need to discuss our next move with you," Salvatore said. "My uncle struck first. We don't have much time." She hesitated, then stepped aside to let him pass, and he lowered his head as he entered the tiny apartment, whose entire floor space was probably smaller than his office. Inside, everything confronted him with brutal clarity. Poverty revealed itself not through figures printed in a report, but through every living detail: the worn sofa covered with a cloth to hide its tears, the damp stains spreading across the ceiling, and the old heater struggling to drive away the winter cold seeping through the cracks around the door. Yet amid all that deprivation, something made him pause: the strange warmth radiating through the room, a kind of warmth the family mansions with their marble fireplaces had never possessed. Then his gaze came to rest on the small wooden table beside the window, where a little girl sat bent over a coloring page, her hair falling forward to conceal her face as she remained completely absorbed in a world of her own. Marlowe hurried toward her, intending either to introduce them or take the child into the other room. But at that moment the little girl lifted her head to look at the unfamiliar visitor, and Salvatore saw the sheet of paper lying before her. His entire body turned to stone. Covering the page from one edge to the other were paper boats. Dozens of tiny paper boats, each one drawn with its bow curving slightly upward and its sides folded into distinct creases in a particular design. A design Salvatore would have recognized even with his eyes closed, because it was exactly the shape of the boat he had formed from silver many years before, exactly the kind of boat he had taught a tearful little sister to make in the cramped kitchen in Little Italy. A childhood game no one else in the world had known about, a secret that had belonged only to the two of them. He stood motionless, his eyes fixed upon the drawing, while something impossible slowly began taking shape inside his mind. "Who?" he tried to ask, but his throat tightened. "Who taught you to draw these boats?" The little girl looked at him with large, clear eyes. Eyes that, now that he was truly looking, he realized were identical to those of someone he hadn't seen for 9 years. "No one taught me, sir," Poppy answered innocently. "I just know how. I always have pictures of these boats inside my head." Salvatore turned toward Marlowe, and his face held a question he didn't dare put into words, though his eyes had already said everything. Marlowe quietly went into the other room, and when she returned, she carried an old tin box containing the last of Gianna's belongings, which she had guarded like treasure. She removed a faded photograph showing Gianna holding a newborn child in her arms, the young mother's face glowing with a happiness that illness and hardship hadn't yet worn away, and handed it to him together with a birth certificate folded into quarters. Salvatore accepted them with trembling hands, and when his eyes passed over the mother's name written on the certificate, the entire world around him seemed to collapse. Poppy was Gianna's daughter. The little girl sitting before him, drawing paper boats, the child living in this crumbling apartment amid the winter cold, was his own flesh and blood, the niece whose existence he had never known about. While he had lived surrounded by luxury and towers that pierced the sky, the only surviving niece of his bloodline had grown up in poverty, raised by a woman who shared no blood with her, simply because his sister had no longer trusted him enough to return. He sank to his knees beside the little table until he was level with the child, and looked at her through eyes blurred with tears, unable to speak. After Poppy was taken to Miss Odessa's apartment to play with the other children in the neighborhood, Salvatore remained in the small apartment, both hands wrapped around the cup of hot tea Marlowe had made for him, though he didn't take a single sip. He sat there for a long time, staring blankly at the drawings of paper boats taped to the wall, and in that silence, everything he had built around himself over the years, the cold exterior, the power that forced others to bow their heads, seemed to lose all meaning. "She kept the child from me," he finally said, his voice rough and hoarse. "Gianna had a daughter, and she chose not to tell me. She would rather let her child grow up in this place, rather entrust her to a stranger, than turn to her own brother. Do you understand what that means, Miss Bennet? It means that in my sister's eyes, a woman she met in a homeless shelter was more worthy of trust than her own flesh and blood." Marlowe lowered herself into the chair across from him, and she didn't rush to comfort him, because she knew there were wounds that couldn't be soothed by easy words. "She didn't hide Poppy from you because she hated you," she said softly. "She hid her because she loved her." Salvatore looked up at her, and Marlowe continued in the slow voice of someone touching a sacred wound. "Gianna understood the world she was born into better than anyone. She knew that in your family, a child who carries the direct bloodline isn't seen as a blessing, but as an asset, something to bargain with, a piece on a board of power that men like your uncle are willing to use whenever it serves them. She had seen with her own eyes how cruel people could become in the struggle for inheritance and control of wealth. She would rather accept that her daughter grow up lacking nearly everything than allow her to be pulled into that current and turned into something other people could use. You ask why she didn't trust you. It wasn't that she didn't trust you as her brother. She didn't trust that you were strong enough to protect Poppy from the very people surrounding you." Those words cut into Salvatore more deeply than any blade, because he knew they were true. His uncle Alberto, the man he had trusted his entire life, was now searching relentlessly for any child who carried Gianna's blood, not so he could love that child, but so he could eliminate a threat. Gianna had foreseen this years earlier while she was still alive, and her fear had never been without reason. He thought of the little sister who used to cry so easily, of the day she had snatched the scarred bracelet from his hands and told him that only a boat with a scar was a boat brave enough to sail away. He thought of the life she must have endured during her final years, carrying the weight of an entire battle against her own family alone, raising her daughter in poverty, bearing a truth no one was willing to hear, and finally dying far too young on a winter night with only a friend beside her instead of the brother who should have been there. "I believed my uncle," he said, and for the first time since Marlowe had met him, the powerful man's voice broke completely. 9 years ago, when he told me Gianna was the traitor, I believed him immediately. I didn't even give her a chance to defend herself. I drove her away. I let her walk out of my life without looking back, and for all those years, I told myself it was her fault so I wouldn't have to live with the guilt." He raised one hand and covered his face. "It turns out the traitor was never my sister. It was me. I was the one who betrayed her at the very moment she needed me to believe in her most." Marlowe said nothing. She simply remained there in silence, allowing that man to weep for the sister he had lost, a grief that had arrived 9 years too late, but was still better than never arriving at all. The call came late at night, not long after Salvatore had left Harborline. It was Dominic, and his voice was so urgent that Salvatore immediately knew something was wrong. One of Dominic's people inside the organization had just reported that Alberto had ordered the entire original file marked AR-2009 to be transferred from the corporation's central archive to a destruction facility. Before dawn the following morning, under the false pretense of disposing of documents whose retention period had expired, once those records were shredded into paper pulp, every piece of evidence connected to the fraud would disappear forever, and with it, the last chance to clear Gianna's name. "We only have tonight," Salvatore said, and he immediately called Marlowe and Nadia. The archive was located deep beneath an auxiliary building controlled by the corporation, and although most of Salvatore's access privileges had been frozen, he knew there was still one entrance his uncle hadn't managed to seal: Nadia's access card, because as an attorney, she still had authorization to enter that area. The three of them met in the dark parking lot behind the building, their breath rising in clouds of white smoke through the freezing air. Nadia used her card to unlock the door, leading down into the basement, and they quietly descended the cold concrete steps, while red emergency lights cast long, distorted shadows across the walls. The archive opened before them like a maze of towering metal shelves packed with document boxes, and they separated to search according to the numbering system Nadia had given them. Marlowe was the first to find it. A stack of boxes already labeled for destruction, and inside were thick files containing page after page of the fraud Alberto had worked so carefully to conceal. But the moment Salvatore opened one of the folders and began turning through it, he noticed something unusual that made the blood in his veins run cold. On many of the most important documents, beneath the legal department's approval signatures from 9 years earlier, appeared a familiar name. The name of the very woman standing only a few steps away from him, Nadia Voss. Salvatore looked up, and his eyes met Nadia's as she saw the file in his hands. In that instant, everything became clear. "It was you," he said slowly, his voice returning to the deadly calm it had carried during their first days together. 9 years ago, you were the one who approved these documents. You didn't merely know about the fraud. You were part of it." Nadia stepped backward, her face turning pale beneath the red light. "You don't understand," she said, her voice trembling. "Back then, I had no other choice. Alberto held a secret from my past, a mistake that could have destroyed my entire life, and he used it to force me to obey him. I was the one who told him Gianna was gathering evidence. It was because of me that she was exposed, that she had to run, that she spent the final years of her life hiding." Tears rolled down her face. "But I have regretted it for all these years. That is why I later passed documents to Gianna, and why I am helping all of you now. I am trying to atone for what I did." Marlo stood frozen, as she realized that the person Gianna had once trusted, the same person Marlo herself had chosen to trust, had been the first link in the chain that forced Gianna into years of wandering and ultimately led to her death. But they had no time for confrontation, because at that very moment, the sound of hurried footsteps thundered from the stairwell, and beams of flashlights swept across the rows of shelves. Alberto's men had arrived to oversee the destruction, and had discovered that someone had broken in. Salvatore reacted in an instant, forcing the stack of the most important files into Marlo's arms. "Take these and run," he said. "The emergency exit is at the end of the shelves on the left. Don't stop, and don't look back, no matter what you hear." Then he stepped into the aisle to block the men rushing toward them. The struggle unfolded beneath the flickering red lights between the metal shelves, and although Salvatore hadn't fought with his own hands in a long time, he still possessed the cold precision and decisiveness that had carried him through the years when he built his empire. He didn't need ruthless violence. He only needed to be fast enough and determined enough to hold them back and buy Marlo every precious second she needed to escape with the files. Shelves were knocked over, boxes scattered across the floor, and shouted voices echoed off the concrete walls. Nadia, after one brief moment of standing paralyzed by guilt, finally chose the right side. She rushed forward, seized the security door, and held it open for Marlo to pass through, accepting that she would now have to face the consequences of her own actions. When Marlo finally forced open the emergency exit and ran into the freezing darkness, clutching the last surviving evidence of a crime buried for 9 years, she heard the heavy door slam shut behind her, and she had no way of knowing what fate awaited the two people still trapped inside. Salvatore and Nadia escaped from the archive that night, battered but safe, and Alberto's men hadn't dared go too far once they realized that the man standing against them still carried the Ricci name and still possessed enough connections to make them cautious. Several days later, when the turmoil had temporarily settled and the files had been carefully copied and stored in several secure locations, Marlo brought Salvatore something she had hesitated for a long time before deciding to place in his hands. It was Gianna's final journal, a faded cloth-bound notebook she had written during the last months of her life, something Marlo had kept hidden as the most private part of the woman who was gone. "I think you should read it," she said softly. "There are things in here that only you need to know, and perhaps they won't be as easy to bear as you hope." Salvatore accepted the journal, and that night, alone in his office high above the city, he opened it beneath the warm yellow light, unaware that those pages were about to take from him the last belief he still clung to, the belief that no matter what else had happened in this tragedy, he himself had remained an innocent victim deceived by his uncle. The opening pages described Gianna's pain, after being cast aside by her own brother, and Salvatore had to stop many times because he couldn't summon enough courage to continue reading. But it was in the middle of the journal that he finally encountered the truth he had never dared face directly. Gianna wrote that she didn't blame him for believing Uncle Alberto, because she understood that Alberto was a masterful manipulator. What wounded her most deeply, what she wrote about again and again across page after page, was another truth, cold and impossible to deny. The entire machine of fraud Alberto had constructed could never have operated without one essential thing, the signature of the man who led the corporation. And Salvatore, during those years when blind ambition had consumed every waking hour of his life, had signed. He had put his name at the bottom of page after page, one power of attorney after another, one approval after the next, without reading a single line, trusting absolutely that his uncle would never exploit that faith. She wrote that she had begged him, just before he drove her away, to examine the papers he had signed for himself, to read them carefully just once before condemning her. But he hadn't done it. He had chosen to believe the easier version of the story, the version in which he carried no blame, and it was that moral laziness, that willingness to close his eyes and sign his name, that had opened the door wide enough for crimes to be committed under his authority. Salvatore closed the journal and remained motionless for a very long time in the darkness. There was no shouting, no outburst of rage, and nothing was broken. There was only the heavy silence of a man who had just been forced to confront the truth of who he was. For days, he had allowed himself to play the grieving brother seeking justice for his sister, the victim of a deceitful uncle. Now, Gianna's own words had stripped that comforting role away from him. Alberto had been the architect, yes, but Salvatore had never been innocent. Trusting too easily wasn't a defense. Being busy wasn't an excuse. Every signature he placed without reading was another moment when he surrendered the power he had been responsible for protecting. And every family that lost its home in Harbor Line, every year his sister spent wandering in hardship, carried the trace of his hand. Not the hand of an evil man, but the hand of someone who had trusted too deeply and been too morally careless to look at the truth for himself. He remembered what his sister had said so many years earlier, that a perfect boat was one that had never dared leave the harbor. And only then did he understand that throughout his entire life of power, he had been a boat so afraid of scars that he had never truly sailed into the open sea of his own conscience. When dawn began to rise beyond the glass walls, Salvatore was still sitting there, and he knew that the road toward redemption wouldn't begin with punishing his uncle. It would begin with admitting his own share of the blame. That dawn witnessed a Salvatore Ricci entirely different from the man he had been in the days before. He was no longer someone seeking justice to cleanse his own honor, nor was he a man desperately clinging to the comforting role of a victim. The night he spent reading Gianna's journal had burned something away inside him, and at the same time, it had forged a new resolve, the cold and sharpened determination of a man who no longer had anything left with which to deceive himself. He summoned Dominic early that morning, and the order he gave left his trusted associate stunned. "I want you to prepare to make everything public," Salvatore said. "Not part of it. Not some carefully polished version designed to protect the Ricci name. Everything, including my own signatures." Dominic looked at him, and after a moment of hesitation, he was forced to say what loyalty required of him. "Do you understand what this means? If you reveal your own share of the responsibility, you won't only bring down Mr. Alberto. You will place yourself directly in the line of fire. Your reputation, your position, and a large part of the empire your father left behind could all collapse with him." Salvatore looked through the glass at the city awakening beneath its blanket of snow. "I know," he replied, "but some things cost more than an empire." What followed was a series of decisive moves that carried the unmistakable style of the man who had once made an entire tower hold its breath, except that this time, all of that cold, formidable strength was directed toward an entirely different purpose. Salvatore didn't operate in darkness as his uncle always had. He did the opposite. He dragged everything into the light. He contacted independent authorities beyond the reach of the Ricci family's influence. He surrendered the original files Marlo had risked her life to save from the archive, along with the additional evidence Nadia, now fully committed to the truth, supplied from within the legal machinery. He hired an outside auditing firm with no connection whatsoever to the corporation to examine every urban development project from the past several years. Most important of all, he summoned a meeting of the family council, the very council that had isolated him only days earlier, but this time he entered the room not as the accused, but as the man holding the entire truth in his hands. The confrontation between Salvatore and Alberto in the conference room that day unfolded without a single shout, yet it carried more tension than any noisy battle. When Alberto saw his nephew enter with the stack of documents in his hands, he still tried to preserve his familiar air of kindness, still tried to steer the discussion back toward the obsession of a confused young man who had lost his way. But no one listened to him this time, because Salvatore laid before them evidence that couldn't be denied, figures that spoke for themselves, signatures, and streams of money flowing into duplicate accounts, whose paths now made it painfully clear where they ultimately led. "You taught me many things," Salvatore said, his voice composed yet cold as ice. "You taught me that blood was the most sacred bond of all, and I believed it so blindly that I allowed you to exploit that trust for years. But you forgot to teach me one thing. Blood isn't a shield behind which a crime can hide. I'm not standing here today to avenge my own honor. I'm here to restore the truth to someone who died, and to accept my own share of the responsibility." He looked directly into his uncle's eyes that for the first time revealed a flicker of genuine panic. "I will surrender everything, including the evidence that condemns me. You may drag me down with you, but you won't escape anymore." And in that moment, everyone in the room understood that the balance of power had shifted, not because Salvatore had become stronger, but because for the first time in his life, he had chosen to stand on the side of what was right, even when the price was himself. The months that followed passed through a succession of trials watched closely by newspapers across Chicago, because it was rare for a family as powerful as the Rixies to expose its own darkest secrets beneath the light of justice. The evidence Marlowe had risked her life to rescue from the archive became the foundation of the entire case, and together with Nadia Voss's testimony and the findings of the independent audit, the full picture of the fraudulent machine Alberto had constructed over so many years gradually emerged before the court. It was proven that enormous sums intended to compensate residents displaced from their homes had been siphoned away and transferred into phantom accounts, that the names of people long dead had been used to collect payments that never reached anyone, and that an entire system had been carefully designed to turn the suffering of the poor into profit for a man sitting beside a warm fireplace in his mansion. Alberto Ricci, the man with the benevolent face and gentle smile, was finally forced to take his place in the defendant's chair, and no amusing story or comforting hand upon a shoulder could save him anymore. The proceedings were neither simple nor neatly resolved like the trials people often saw in movies. Some charges were proven, while others had to be revised when the evidence wasn't strong enough, and several accomplices chose to testify in exchange for leniency. Salvatore himself also had to face his share of responsibility, and he didn't attempt to avoid it. He publicly admitted that his blind trust and negligence had allowed the crimes to take place, and he accepted the severe legal and financial consequences that followed. In the end, Alberto was convicted on numerous charges involving conspiracy to commit fraud, falsification of records, and unlawful seizure of assets, and he received a prison sentence along with enormous financial penalties. Most of the wealth he had accumulated was ordered to be returned, but for the people who had fought for the truth, the most important outcome wasn't the punishment imposed upon the guilty man. What mattered most was that Gianna Ricci's name was finally recorded fairly in the official record. For 9 years, she had been called a traitor, an embezzler, and the daughter who had disgraced her family. Now, the court documents clearly stated that she had been the person who discovered the crimes and tried to expose them, that the accusations made against her all those years ago had been fabricated, and that she had been right from the very beginning. To people who lived inside glass towers, perhaps a single sentence in an official record meant very little. But Marlowe understood its significance, because she knew that lies, when no one ever corrects them, eventually become history, and then become truth in the memories of generations yet to come. Now, history had finally been rewritten as it should have been. Yet, as Salvatore sat in the courtroom, on the day the final judgment was read aloud, he felt none of the triumph he had once imagined. Among all the things justice could repair, there was one thing it could never do. It couldn't bring Gianna back. No sentence, no corrected line in any official record, could return his sister to him, restore the years that had been taken from her, or allow her to witness the day her name was cleared. She had died on a bitter winter night carrying the burden of an injustice that was never hers, and everything they had reclaimed that day had arrived too late for the person who deserved it most. Salvatore sat silently among the crowd, and he understood that even the victory of justice could sometimes carry the bitter, salty taste of tears. When the dust of the trials had finally settled, Salvatore was forced to confront a question more difficult than any legal battle, a question that had nothing to do with power or wealth, but touched the most sacred thing still remaining of his family. Poppy was his biological niece, the only direct descendant left who carried Ricci blood, and everything that remained of the little sister he had lost. With the immense power and resources at his disposal, he could easily have fought for custody of the child, easily have taken her to live in a magnificent mansion, sent her to the finest schools, dressed her in the most beautiful clothes, and allowed her to grow up surrounded by luxury beyond anything a child from Harborline would ever dare to imagine. There were lawyers who suggested exactly that, reminding him that by blood, he had more than enough grounds to make such a claim. and that a poor woman with no biological connection would find it difficult to compete in court against a wealthy uncle. To the man Salvatore once had been, the man accustomed to taking everything he wanted, that argument would undoubtedly have sounded tempting. But he sat with the question for a long time, and he thought about the words in Gianna's journal, about the fear his sister had carried with her until the moment she died, the fear that her daughter would be drawn into the cold world of power surrounding the family, transformed into a piece on a board, an asset, a name on an inheritance chart. He thought about how his own blind faith in blood had caused so much suffering, and he understood that if he now used that same argument of blood to separate Poppy from the woman who had loved and raised her with her whole heart, he would be betraying his sister's final wish all over again. Poppy didn't need an uncle who came to assert ownership over her. She needed to grow up within the love she already possessed, in the arms of the mother she trusted with the entirety of a child's heart, in the place that, though poor, was warm and familiar to her. And so Salvatore made a decision that the man he had been a year earlier would probably never have understood. He chose not to take her. One late winter afternoon, as the first rays of an approaching spring began melting the ice from Harbor Line's rooftops, Salvatore returned to the small apartment shared by mother and daughter, but this time he brought no documents and no carefully calculated moves. He simply sat down on the floor beside the little wooden table where Poppy was drawing, and for the first time in his life, the man who had once made an entire empire tremble allowed a child to command him in her game. "I know how to fold paper boats," he said softly, and his voice was so gentle that even he found it unfamiliar. Poppy's eyes lit up. "Really? Will you teach me? I draw boats all the time, but I've never managed to fold a good one." And so, beneath the warm golden afternoon light, uncle and niece sat together folding paper boats, his large, rough hands patiently guiding her tiny fingers through each crease, exactly as he had once taught another little girl many years earlier in a cramped kitchen. Marlo stood leaning against the kitchen doorway, silently watching them, and tears shimmered in her eyes. Tears she made no effort to wipe away, because she understood that what was unfolding before her was what Gianna had always longed for, not a reunion surrounded by wealth, but healing. When the first boat was finished, Poppy cradled it in her palm like a treasure, then looked up and asked in the clear voice of a child, "Uncle, will this boat ever be able to sail?" Salvatore looked at the little paper boat in his niece's hand, and his throat tightened as his sister's words from long ago echoed back to him. "Of course it will," he replied, his voice growing hoarse. "It will certainly sail, because the bravest boats are always the ones willing to leave the harbor." Marlo Bennett's story didn't end the way fairy tales usually do, and perhaps that is precisely what gives it its truest value. She didn't suddenly become wealthy. No one discovered that she was the long-lost heir of some powerful family. She didn't enter into a marriage with a powerful man to transform her life, nor was she given a grand mansion or an enormous bank account as a reward for her courage. After everything that happened, her life remained the life of an ordinary working woman, still filled with bills that had to be paid, mornings that required her to rise early, and everyday hardships that never disappeared completely. But she had reclaimed something more precious than anything money could ever buy, her name and her dignity. She was no longer the woman in torn clothing who had been dragged away from a doorway like a beggar. She was Marlo Bennett, the woman who kept her promise to someone approaching death, the woman who stood before an entire empire of power without taking a single step backward, and the woman who proved that kindness and resilience weren't privileges reserved for the wealthy. With support she accepted according to her own principles, not as charity handed down to her, but as compensation she had rightfully earned. Marlo returned to the path of education that life had once forced her to abandon. She studied housing policy and community rights because she understood better than anyone that the best way to protect vulnerable people wasn't to wait for the sudden kindness of some powerful individual, but to build lasting systems that allowed those people to protect themselves. At Harbor Line, instead of being demolished to make way for towering buildings, the old apartment blocks were renovated and preserved for the very people who had lived there for so many years, and a small community center was established, where Miss Odessa continued teaching children how to read, where Mr. Rubin still repaired pipes, and where Marlo opened classes that taught residents how to understand documents, how to recognize their rights, and how to walk into an office with their heads held high and demand what they deserved, just as Gianna had once taught her during the darkest night of her life. Life there wasn't perfect. There were still inconveniences, shortages, and complaints about all the ordinary troubles of daily living, and that very imperfection was the clearest proof that the change was real, rather than some polished ending created for a story. Salvatore remained part of Poppy's life, but in exactly the way he had chosen, as an uncle who stood gently at the edges, appearing during afternoons spent folding paper boats, during holidays, and during the quiet, ordinary moments he had never known how to value while he was consumed by power. He learned that redemption wasn't a glorious moment when a crowd rose to applaud, but a quiet and enduring discipline of repairing what one had done wrong, of releasing control, and of remaining present even after the cameras had been turned off and no one was watching to offer praise. And if there is one lesson that remains from this entire story, it is the lesson hidden within the paper boat bracelet itself. It was precious, but the metal from which it was made was never the most important thing. What mattered was everything that happened before anyone noticed it. A woman stood before a gate holding the truth in her hands, and because her clothes were torn, people laughed at her. Because she had no address, they treated her as though she didn't exist. Because she had no title, they assumed she knew nothing. Only when a powerful man recognized a familiar object on her wrist did the doors finally open. But respect should have opened those doors from the beginning, long before anyone recognized the bracelet. Human dignity isn't a reward reserved for those who prove their value to the powerful. It is something every person deserves, simply because they are human. If the story of Marlowe and the paper boat bracelet has touched something deep within your heart, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share this video with the people around you, so that each day we can continue listening together to more meaningful stories that move the human spirit. We would truly love to hear how this story made you feel, so please don't hesitate to leave a comment sharing the honest thoughts and emotions rising from the deepest part of your heart, because every word you write is a precious source of encouragement that helps us continue this storytelling journey. Thank you for staying with us until the final moments. We wish everyone watching this video lasting good health, a joyful and peaceful life, and days filled with love. Goodbye for now, and we look forward to meeting you again in the stories yet to come.